This leads the nice scene to our first panel discussion on reaching net zero, unlocking the Scope 3 challenge. As more and more countries are setting ambitious targets for climate neutrality and to have an economy with net zero greenhouse gas emissions, let's discuss this further with our distinguished panelists, and I would like them to invite to the stage. Noor Krabendam, Associate EU Business Development, The Carbon Trust. Then Ursula Woodburn, Head of EU Relations, CLG Europe, Program Director, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Our third panelist is Margarita Lysenkova, Senior Manager from the Global Reporting Initiative, and Simon Gale, Scope 3 Peer Group, who will be joining us online. And the discussions will be moderated by my colleague, Bruno Guemes. He is the Environmental Programs Manager at Amfori. Bruno?
Thank you. First I'm going to...
The floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. I guess you cannot hear me. I'm usually very loud, so probably even without the microphone, you could hear me. I do want to take the liberty to pick up on something Benafsha said, which I think is very important. I know it's horrible to talk about myself when we have a wonderful panel here, but I do want to say, whilst the presentation begins, because I do have a couple of slides, that my background is on humanitarian response and NGOs and international development. And she said something very important about the communities who are most affected, the poorest of the poor, children, women, and girls particularly, right? So that's where I used to work. And people ask me, why did you change sectors? I changed sectors because I was working on adaptation, which is really important, but I always believe that if we prevent things, or we all do, preventing makes the biggest changes, because it's much better to prevent than to heal. And there's a huge potential in companies who are working well in order to reduce the impacts and reduce the emissions. There's a lot of data there. There's a lot of science that supports this. And I'm really happy to be in an association that works with so many companies, small, medium, and large, who really want to make things better. Because if we do that together, we're really going to have a huge impact, and we're going to avoid those impacts on those communities. So I really wanted to say that, because I think it's really important. So first thing, let's just set the scene. I mean, you all know this. You all know that there's some legal background. Let me just put the time, because I'm not timing myself, and that makes me a horrible moderator. Please don't tell my boss. All right. So as you know, there are quite a few legislative and regulative issues that we have to keep in consideration, but also lots of trends regarding consumers. First of all, you all know about the Paris Agreement. If you haven't heard about it, I recommend that you read about it. It's an important thing. That limits temperatures well below 2 degrees, but we should try to aim at 1.5, right? Then climate neutrality is something that is already a pillar of the European Union's growth strategy and regulations. There are climate goals embedded in the EU Green Deal, which, again, if you haven't read about it, it's very nice to read that at night before going to sleep. Climate legislation now is very specific. If you don't know about Fit for 55 package and all the things that are detailed there, it's very important. So it's setting the way for more challenging legislation, rules, etc. There's also transversal legislation that is embedded into all other types of legislation. We're talking about HREDD, which is the perfect example. It was just explained right now. And then, of course, it's not only about the European Union. We're here with members from many places. We have business partners all over the world, and there are regulations that are ever more challenging. I just mentioned China and the US because they're two of the biggest markets, but not only there, everywhere. And the trend is that it's going to be more and more challenging. We'll go to the next one, please. What do we do in Amfori? In Amfori at the moment, if we look at our environmental tool, Amfori BEPI, what we do is we measure Scope 3 emissions based on energy consumption per site. We know it doesn't cover all Scope 3 emissions, but it does give you quite a good idea of what is happening. In the new tool that we are just migrating right now, by the way, we have set a sort of product intensity. So basically, we calculate how many products is that site producing and how many they're selling downstream to the next tier or to the member. And then we calculate how many emissions would be attributed to the member. So it's better than what we had in the past. It's not perfect because not all products are the same. There's a lot of things that have to do with raw materials. I hope that we can talk about that now. But at least we're working on it, and we really want to get better. That's why we believe a lot in partnerships. Can we go to, oh yeah, sorry. I did want to mention a couple of very important things. There's an energy and climate performance area in our BEPI. For those of you who use BEPI, you already know. And there's something very important that we're about to launch, which is the AMFRE Climate Lab. And Amanda, are you around here? Amanda is back there. She's leading that. It's a really great idea to talk about climate ideas and climate trends. By the way, all of you who receive our pulse, it went out today, if I'm not mistaken. And there is a link to a wonderful survey. Please open it and fill it in, because that's going to be very helpful. And also for us, it's very, very important to have key partnerships. That's why we're here today. And I think there's one more. Just for you to know, we did some surveys with our members. These are some of the data that we got from the surveys. We didn't ask all members. We asked in the General Assembly, but this is what we got back. Climate and Scope 3 emissions are always ranking on the top of the priorities for most of our members. 36% of them were already calculating or reporting for Scope 3 when we asked, but up to 40% of them were planning to do so. They were already working on it. So we're talking about almost 80%. We know of at least 30 companies that already have climate pledges, but I'm pretty sure it's way more already. Almost 70% of them plan to have targets, many of them SBTi. And the biggest difficulties, as we know, is to find reliable data, and because there's a lot of complexity in Scope 3. That's why this session is called what it's called. So now, without further ado, there's my 5 minutes, or a little bit more. I'm going to go with my panelists, and I'm going to go and sit somewhere in there, because I'd rather sit with you than be here. Okay? So. Is this on? Yeah, great, wonderful. So I have a yellow and a red folder. Whenever we are halfway through the allocated time, I'll show you the yellow one, just like a referee. And then when it's like 1 minute before the end, I'll show you the red one. And then if you go over the time, then people will start booing. No, just kidding. Okay? Right, so should we start maybe from the end?
Sure.
It's Nor, right?
It's
Yes,
Nor. Yeah, does this work? Perfect. Thank you for the invite, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here and already heard such a wonderful talk. So my name is Nor Krabbedam. I'm an associate at Carbon Trust. Some people might know it, but we have been around for 20 years, originally kind of founded in the UK, but we are currently an international climate consultancy. We work with both kind of with governments, municipalities, civil organizations, and with corporates to kind of support them on that net zero journey. From a governmental perspective, we won't touch about it today too much, but we are working together on, for example, offshore wind accelerator, energy access programs. So those are kind of large multi-stakeholder programs. The division that I sit in personally is the Business Services Department, and that is that I support international companies to kind of accelerate that move to a net zero transition, which might seem like a large transition because it is. I support them from the very beginning. So that is you're calculating your scope 1 and 2 emission that we just quickly touched upon, which is basically your own emissions. And from there, you start calculating those very, very complex scope 3 emissions. And that is really the foundation for your entire climate strategy. So then we support from there setting targets, which are in any case aligned with the Paris Agreement to avert the worst climate crises. And from there, you kind of assess what does that mean for our business? How quickly do we need to reduce? What is kind of that target feasibility assessment? Do we need to completely switch our business model? Do we need to look into circularity? And what is the risk of climate change, for example, on our business, which are TCFD exercises? So these are programs, if we start from the very beginning to the end, and if you want to get to net zero, you might be looking at a 10-year trajectory. And that is also what a climate strategy really is. So my responsibilities are primarily for the Benelux and France market. And as I said, we primarily work with kind of large international companies. The reason is because they have the largest kind of supply chain and value chains. If they have the largest, let's say, negative impact now, that also means that they have the largest impact to make changes and to bring that whole supply chain with them. So my responsibility is to kind of create that strategy. Where are you now? How ambitious do you need to be? I challenge them. There might be some uncomfortable conversations, but it really to kind of everything is towards the mission that we as Carbon Trust have to reach that net zero target. And I also lead on our policy work, which means, as we quickly touched upon, what is the impacts of CSRD on your business? What is the impact of EU taxonomy? How do you ensure you're ahead of the curve? How do you ensure you're not doing just for compliance reasons? And these are kind of, we can see that all these pressures are coming from customers, policies, internally, and that is really what that Scope 3 is about. It's not just your own operations. You need to be in contact with your suppliers. You need to be in contact with your customers. Internally, there needs to be an engagement. So that is kind of what Carbon Trust is for. And I'm happy to, in the other section, to kind of really break down how complex that Scope 3 is and why you all need to work together to be able to obtain the data and from there to reduce.
Okay, that was very efficient. Thank you, Noe. That was really, really nice and really quick. We are going to have some time for questions at the end of the session, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So please keep your questions for the end. Okay. Ursula, please go ahead.
Hi. So it's great to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation, Amphori. I realise my title is kind of quite long and confusing, so perhaps I should explain it a bit. So I run the Brussels office for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And for those of you who are not aware of CISL, we have a number of different types of activities in this area. We are a department of the University of Cambridge, and we run education programs for companies, both targeted education programs, but also a number of you, I'm sure, have seen the ads pop up on Facebook for things like online courses on sustainable value chains and things like that. We are also engaged in quite a few different projects with SMEs and accelerators, whether through the SME Climate Hub, there's an education program called Climate Fit for SMEs, or indeed through some different types of accelerators and so forth for smaller organizations. I mean, where I sit, however, is more in the Brussels context. So I work with a number of cross-sectoral business platforms, including Corporate Leaders Group Europe, where we're really trying to work with leading companies to assess really the big challenges, but support the transition to a climate neutral Europe, a sustainable economy. And what this means is that we're really looking at the different challenges that there are in the system, but supporting policy and unblocking some of the different things, some of the different regulations that can be important in achieving that. And more broadly, we really also look at key aspects of research and thought leadership to unpick some of these really difficult questions, whether it's about carbon accounting, CBAM, or policy implementation. Recently, we've been doing some work on digital product passports and other types of things. So, I mean, basically, we sit in a situation where we do a lot of education. We bring together business together to discuss some of the key problems. We convene business with policymakers, but also look at some of the broader questions that are really affecting the transition. So that's where we sit.
All right. Thank you, Noor. That was, again, very efficient.
Ursula.
Sorry, Ursula. Thank you, Ursula. You're way more efficient than me. Don't blame me. I'm going to blame my migraine for that. And Margarita, right? Okay, Margarita, please go ahead. And then we have Simon online after this. Is it not working?
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on. Hello, everybody. Glad to be here. And I'm representing GRI, so I'm going to bring the corporate reporting perspective, highlight the landscape, and the expectations for corporate transparency with regards to also Scope 3. So at GRI, we've been producing corporate disclosure for about 25 years. It's been voluntary corporate disclosure, which now is increasingly becoming mandatory at a very high speed. And that is unsurprising because with climate change being on the global agenda, countries have committed to net zero, and hence corporates see the regulation coming their way, and they also have to align with that regulation, although, let's say, the speed of this regulation is not the same in all countries. And at present, many companies measure and target reductions in their operations, so that refers to scopes 1 and 2. And by definition, scope 3, is different because those are the emissions that the organization does not directly control, but has, let's say, a leverage with suppliers, for example. It can be in the upstream, it can be in the downstream. And the empirical estimates show, so CDP data, for instance, that a company's supply chain emissions are on average 5 times higher than the emissions from own operations. In the GRI standards, the emission standard GRI 305 includes disclosure on scope 3, and its reference is the GSG protocol, corporate accounting and reporting standard, which is, let's say, the de facto global standard for doing the inventory for scope 3 emissions that identifies 15 categories. And demanding transparency on scope 3 emissions is also a clear trend that we observe in our multi-stakeholder processes. So we run multi-stakeholder working groups to produce each and every of our standards, whether topic standards, which we have about 31, and sector standards as well. So there we clearly see that investor constituency, for example, is demanding transparency on scope 3. And we also see in corporate disclosure that companies may often disclose against a certain number of scope 3 categories or the categories that they deem material, but it's still, let's say, not consistent and certain things are left for interpretation. In our sector work, as I mentioned, in the fossil fuel extractive sectors in particular, so oil and gas and coal, scope 3 is critical disclosure that captures the transition risk. And scope 3 in the sectors constitute up to 90% of value chain emissions. And to get those down, companies to make drastic changes to their business model. So more information is needed, let's say, beyond the scope 3 figure, as it may affect companies' capital allocation for prospective new reserves or investing in new technology. So it changes things a lot, basically. And additional information is needed, so it cannot be looked at isolation. Companies also are expected to report on their strategies, on commitments and targets on the transition, as well as, just transition and reskilling workers who need to adapt to the changing technologies. And in other sector work, so like mining, for example, refining and melting processes can be very emissions intensive. So in this case, partnering with suppliers on fuel switching can be part of a solution. In our agriculture sector work, scope 3 links, we found that it links significantly to the conversion, of course. And it's a very difficult conversation because when you talk conversion, you need to talk about the cutoff date, and you need to understand from when you're counting. So there is also a GSG protocol for the agriculture sector now being produced. And now at GRI, we're also starting a textiles project. So we're also going to see about the sources of scope 3 in textiles. And also on let's say, research. So in the KPMG survey published just now in October 2022, it was found that 55% of FTSE 100 companies are getting insurance on their scope 3 emissions, and that, of course, demonstrates the challenges to get this data accurate. There are also interesting developments that we see in the corporate reporting landscape. So, for example, there's been a recent consultation on the proposed ISSB standards, and there was an analysis issued by Morningstar of the responses to this public consultation, where they actually found that while 40% of surveyed prefer ISSB to require scope 3 emissions disclosure, 2 out of 7 most prominent and biggest investors actually think that it should be limited or deferred. Finally, ESRS draft contains also a scope 3 disclosure, and with the ISSB's intention to draw up global baseline for corporate reporting by end of the year, we may see also some convergence there. And as my final remark, I want to say that the IPCC believes that this delta between possible emissions cut and hence the global warming delta will mean a significant difference in terms of poverty, again, extreme heat, habitat loss, and so on. So just transition is also as much as an important component of transparency around net zero. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We should have, in case you were asleep, that was absolutely planned. We should have Simon online. Hello, Simon.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly well. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Am I enormous on the screen there?
You're huge. Yeah, actually, you're on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screens. So
Well, I can assure you that I'm actually this big, but there's not this many of me, so it's a little bit deceiving. Afternoon, everybody. Firstly, apologies for not being there in person. It's a story of personal incompetence, so I won't go into it. My name's Simon. I'm a board member at a company called Proxima. We're a procurement and supply chain consultancy. And if you haven't heard of Proxima, we're also part of Bain & Company. So what do we do? Well, statistically speaking, for everyone who's in the room now, 75% of your business costs go to your supply chain. That's just the way that businesses are built today. We call it external enterprise. And our job in Proxima is to help companies to spend that money. Now, hopefully, we help them to spend that money and get more value for that money, but also to create more value from that money. And so, we always use the 75% number, and we say now you can attribute that yes, that's cost, but also it could be risk, it could be emissions, it could be innovation, it could be social value. Ultimately, the largest part of your business is in your supply chain, and we help with that. So my job specifically, I'm responsible for developing our products and services. I'm responsible for doing advisory to chief procurement officers and supply chain officers. So really it's about figuring out what the market needs and then going and trying to convince people to do something different and actually go and make a change happen. The more interesting part of me, my second hat, is that I'm here today as a representative of the Scope 3 peer group. So the Scope 3 peer group is a collection of organizations. It's about 1,000 people who specifically come together to say, do you know what? Can't tackle this on my own. We need to collaborate on how we're going to address Scope 3 in our supply chain. So it's procurement people, supply chain people, so the people who are out there talking to suppliers day to day. Where do Proxima and the supply chain and the Scope 3 peer group come together? Well, we've just developed and we're launching today the Scope 3 maturity benchmark. So companies such as Sky, Lonza, Reckitt, SC Johnson, Aldi, about 20 in total, have come together to create a benchmark model that says, hey, what am I doing? What might I do next? And what do I aspire to? And through November and December, we'll open that up to a wider selection of people. Why are we doing this? Well, I can reflect back to you the conversations that I'm having. So this year, I've probably spoken to 50 or 60 chief procurement officers, chief supply chain officers, most of whom haven't really started on their Scope 3 journey. What are the problems they're facing? Well, I think the first one, the obvious one, is there's no playbook. People love to copy what's been done before, but they've got to figure this out themselves. I think secondly, procurement people are quite rightly obsessed with data, and the data is not perfect. And so, it's acting on data that perhaps we don't trust. Thirdly, solutions don't exist to some of the things that we want to solve. So it's an innovation challenge. And again, we've got to get ourselves into the mindset of how to go and engage and create innovation from suppliers. I think fourthly, standards. That can confuse people. We've heard a lot today about emerging standards and emerging regulation. And finally, cost. Crafting the case that actually convinces executives to go and deliver the change now, which is probably perhaps the most critical.
I don't know. Okay. Thank you very much. Again, we have plenty of time for questions, but before that, there are a few things that you mentioned that I think are very important. In summary, I think they're actually quite linked to what we got from our surveys. Like there's a lot of challenges. It's very hard to find good data or standardized data. There's lots of there's not enough homogeneity with data, so it's kind of difficult to trust and to see which data to trust or not. Not enough tools and standards. Something that was very interesting that I heard, I think, from Nord was that this is not a sprint. It takes a long time to do things. They're talking about 10-year transitions, which is very important. It's not something that you can do from the morning until, between night and day. It takes some time. It's also something that you all mentioned is that it's very important to work throughout supply chains. So there is a challenge, and we hear that from our members, in working, sometimes in engaging business partners. That's something that is very difficult. And that was going to be one of my first questions, particularly to Simon, because you said that you work on, to Simon, but to all of you, you said that you work on convincing. That was very interesting. So I really wanted to ask you, and then extend it to the rest of the speakers, if that's possible, and then we can go to the audience. How hard or how easy do you find it nowadays to convince people to do this? And we can make a difference between the companies themselves and how to support the companies in convincing and getting business partners into really engaging into the process, because that can be complicated sometimes. So if it's okay, can we start with you, Simon?
Yeah, sure. I think it's it really varies by company. So there are companies that I've worked with who see the advantage in moving early from a revenue perspective, and there are companies that I've worked with who don't, because perhaps they don't believe they can go and influence their suppliers. And I think with my sort of sales hat on, I spent a while in sales, and I realized that there were two ways to sell things to people. One was better than others. One is to convince them that there's an opportunity, and the other is to scare them. And I think people, a lot of executives that I've met, unfortunately, they take it all in, but they're just not scared yet. They don't see the cost implication that's going, it's sort of out there, but it's not really real to them at a time when they're battling inflation. And so I think you have to look at everybody you're talking to, and it might be different people. It might be someone who looks after buildings or fleet or marketing or the budgets. And you have to figure out what value means to them, value in their eyes, and how to tell a story and convince them that involves not only logic, but also emotion. Because, neuroscientists will tell you that 85% of our decisions we take on an emotional basis. And so I think we have to be a little bit sophisticated in the way that we approach people who are perhaps not living this every day.
Thank you. That was very insightful. The most important thing I took from this scare people. I mean, it's spooky, but Halloween is really around the corner. I don't know. Does any of you want to add anything to this? I'm really sorry. And I'm not nervous. I'm just like that.
Yeah, no, I agree a lot with what Simon was saying, and I also think this calls back to Binafsha's really incredible keynote speech, where she talked about both the urgency of the context, but also the potential for competitive advantage, and also that the regulation is coming, right? So it's coming, right? So the question is, as a company, what do you want to be in 10 years, right? Where do you want to be? What do you need to be if you're going to be ready for the world that we're going to have in 10 years? And if you then think back from that, if you backcast, what do you need to do now? And last year I interviewed quite a few of the companies that we work with, and they talked about this. They talked about the need to backcast rather than forecast. If you sit here now and you say, feasibly, we can have incremental change to get to this point, you're probably not going to have the scale you need. You need to look at what you need to be in 10 years and backcast from that and see how you're going to do that. And that will require a massive innovation, collaboration, thinking about all the different partnerships that you can leverage. But that's the only way that we'll attempt to tackle the scale of the urgency or the emergency that we need to do so.
Yes, if you want to add something, please.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of go back to what in essence a Scope 3 is. A Scope 3 is not necessarily your emissions, because your Scope 3 might be someone else's Scope 1 and 2, and their Scope 1 and 2 might be someone else's Scope 3. So it's inherently linked. So even just the fundamentals of calculating it, you are reliant on supplier-specific data. You need to reach out to your suppliers. Hey, can you help me getting supplier-specific emission factors, for example? But you also need to be reliant on who do you sell it to? What do they do to a product, to a service? What are the emissions associated with it? So that is purely, I mean, then we're going into kind of the greenhouse gas protocol, which is a very kind of, yeah, black and white kind of calculation method. But what does it really mean? It means that you can only kind of get to any target really if you consider and look at yourself, where do we sit within an entire system of kind of our emissions that we are responsible of putting into the atmosphere. And if your company sets a target, this has immense impact, hopefully encouraging impact, to everyone you work with. And also you need to think about it on an individual level, because if you don't engage your internal employers that what is coming to your business, then no way you would ever reach a net zero target. If you don't inform your next door colleague saying what will happen in the upcoming years, if there is not encouragement or engagement, you will not succeed in this strategy. So really look at how do we fit into the system? Who do we need to kind of to reach this? Who do we need to get the data? Who do we need to get to target? And then start switching it around, as you said. What are kind of the major risks to our companies? Because it's not a matter of we're ahead of the curve, such as innovation, for example. Climate change won't slow down because you are not taking action. It just means that you need to, every year you don't take action, you need to accelerate faster, harder, and it's going to impact your business in a way that you might not even be able to exist in a normal way. And as you say, scope 3, it's not an insulated thing. It's scope 1 and 2 is, but scope 1 and 2 is a very, very small part of any business. There are just a few businesses around the world that have a larger scope 1 and 2 than their scope 3. So really think about kind of what is the system that we operate in when we talk about emissions, and from there a net zero future.
Perfect. I don't know, Margareta, if you want to add something or not.
Yeah, I can make a small addition to that, that also, I mean, on the accuracy can be improved over time. So it's really important to start mapping the supply chain and understanding where those emissions reduction potential are. And then depending also on sector, there are different resources available for companies. So for example, also in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency has tools that assist in doing the inventory. And for the agriculture sector, as I mentioned, that has specific challenges. Also, there's a consortium of NGOs called the Accountability Framework Initiative that came also with a very detailed guidance also related to conversion. So how to set, for example, those cutoff dates and how to start calculating the emissions from your conversion. So depending on which sector you're in, you can also find resources available.
Okay. Thank you all. I think it's very clear that when we look at this from my point of view, right, that we look at the deadline on 2030 or 2050, and we think that's the deadline, but the deadline is today or tomorrow. Otherwise, we won't make it. The deadline is not there. That's a milestone, but the deadline is today to do things. Because otherwise, like you just said, it may be too late to actually adapt, and maybe our business won't be able to exist. It will be too expensive or impossible to do. So yeah, that's a really good takeaway. The deadline is now, and be scared, of course. And now I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. So please go ahead and.
Thank you.
Should be on now, maybe. Could you try again? Because they have to.
We were fortunate to have an
Yeah.
event on Friday in this very room, so I'm a bit familiar now switching the mics on and off. My name is Lebo Mofulo, and I work for Fruitcom as Trade and Sustainability Advisor. That's the European association that represents importers of dried fruit and nuts, processed fruit and vegetables, and processed fish and seafood products. It's a pleasure to be here, in part also because we have some former colleagues who have transitioned to Amfori, and we've had Amfori at some of our events prior. So I have questions too, which I'm sure will be straightforward for this august panel. The first question is that we've done some events on the carbon footprint, and we've actually had a speaker, Tiffany Aris from the Carbon Trust, to help elaborate these issues for our members. Our members are based all over the world, North America, Europe, Australia, Turkey, and South America. And what is always evident, as has been repeated here, is that scope 3 emissions, which tend to be coming from the origin of the raw materials, that's from the producers, are the biggest, the biggest source of the carbon footprint of our members. But those of our members representing producers have increasingly said that they are feeling disheartened and are being, let's say, framed as the problem, the source of the problem. And producers are increasingly becoming reluctant to even share data. They become suspicious that it will result in maybe they're losing access, market access, transition costs, adaptation costs. So my first question is how to ensure that farmers, producers, and other stakeholders in the origin locations can be included in this transition, especially when it comes to sensitive questions like sharing of data. And the second question, I mean, what benefit, concretely, what is in it for them? And then the second question, which is very related and is also partly personal, as I come from Lesotho, is, you are asking producers, you're asking stakeholders in origin countries to contribute to these sustainability or due diligence or carbon objectives. And the question I often get also from our origin members is why should the priority for them be, these targets related to Europe, related to North America, when they have equally legitimate sustainability objectives, which are perhaps even more critical and immediate there. So how do we ensure this inclusivity that I think some of the panel members had mentioned? Thank you.
Yes. Should we first respond and then we take the from Ansari? Who wants to go first?
Well, I can
All right.
talk about this from a. I'm quite happy to talk about this from a procurement perspective. I'm certainly no expert when it comes down to the detail, but you can have every strategy that you want, but if that doesn't translate into the supplier engagement, you're going to fail. And I think my profession has spent decades building cheap, non-transparent supply chains to get products, goods, services, whatever, to our companies at the lowest price. And we have to go back fundamentally and consider what value is and what we're asking those providers to do. It is absolute imperative at the moment that we consider the impact of our decisions and our requests on our suppliers, particularly those who are struggling with it, and where necessary, particularly where social value and equity is concerned, that we help to develop those suppliers. And that's quite hard for one company to do on its own, which is where actually cross-sector collaboration that can create meaningful demand is so important. And it's important why organisations should work together to help to not only develop those suppliers in the supply chain, but also to enable them to attract investment by creating that meaningful demand.
Thanks, Simon. Does anybody else want to contribute?
Yeah, I mean, these are very good, but also very large questions, and I'm not sure if I'm the right person to talk about, because Carbon Trust is so fixated on kind of carbon accounting, and we are very much aware of that. In terms of it's really a question of responsibility to some extent, and that is always a difficult question to ask. Why should I be responsible for someone else's emissions if I'm not the largest contributor, for example? However, we should really kind of flip the question a little bit, saying, what could be potential your benefit if we work together in, for example, calculating emissions? Could it be that we support you on making processes more efficient, for example, and starting the conversation with, we have looked at our value chain. We've seen that the largest emissions are coming from our suppliers. It's our responsibility to reduce it, but we need to work together, and asking the questions, what do you see as a potential kind of, either is it innovation, is it efficiency? Do you need support on kind of reducing emission from specific processes. So start asking questions because your supplier knows the business better than you do as a buyer. Because otherwise you're just imposing mechanism. The only thing that you have is your target. And what we say, Carbon Trust, you need to get there, but take into account that you're reliant and you are responsible also for your suppliers to make sure that they are in there. But it could also mean that you need to say goodbye to some suppliers if they're not willing to work with you. However, we're not at the stage there where you say goodbye to your suppliers. We are at the stage of asking them questions. Where can we support you? Provided that you are that large corporate with the resources and the budget to be able to support them. That's what I can say in terms of bigger questions, of course, on where national responsibility lays in terms of kind of countries that haven't contributed that much. That's a larger question that I won't be able to answer.
Yeah, you wanna?
Yeah, I would also like to contribute to say that also companies usually have, let's say, balanced sustainability objectives. So not only in the space of the environmental impacts, but also social impacts. And that essentially also means providing decent work to people and also managing the, let's say, your procurement relationships so that your suppliers receive living income. And that's now, I mean, there are also a lot of global framework agreements on that. And there are, let's say, actors pushing from the other side. So it could be local partners, trade unions and so on. And companies also use supplier improvement projects and invest into this because clearly, I'd say companies are not interested that suppliers go bankrupt. I mean, suppliers need markets, and that's their incentive to be to align. But then also companies need their suppliers, so they need to allocate funds, let's say, and share this burden of transitioning to more sustainable production.
I would like to add something from AmFree BPI. We're not a climate tool, but AmFree BPI is an environmental performance tool, and we strive to continuous improvement, right? AmFree BPI, what it is not a green company's catalog, and it should never be a green company catalog. And we are very aware that when business partners are responding to questionnaires, sometimes they can be very afraid because we've heard it from them and we've heard it from pilots and tests. They're very afraid that if they report grievances or any legal issues that they have, that they may be, they may be left out of a supply chain or whatever. But we're not, and this is something that we make very clear to our members. We sign documents with we have a code of conduct, and we have certain documents in which at least we state that it's very important that members support business partners to improve. It's not a green catalog. The idea is that they trust us, we trust them, so that they can really show the problems that they have, and we can support them in improving. At least that's at the core of what we do at AmFree BPI. But we're not a carbon tool. It's just one of the components, but just one of the things that I think is very important, and we need to understand that it's a mutual relationship, and we really need to strive for improvement, not just for, cataloging. And then, and then the second point, I think there's a lot. I mean, it's a huge thing to discuss because it has a lot to do with legislation and with advocacy. But I also think it's a two-way relationship. It shouldn't be always that legislation is imposed, and I hope my colleagues from advocacy will not kill me afterwards because I'm not the expert. But there is a lot of feedback coming advocacy-wise also from business partners and communities that should be heard. I know there have been recent examples, for example, with the deforestation regulation and the georeferentiation, that it was to be the plot and now it's the site coordinates, things that have been achieved through advocacy. I think that's a very important role because sometimes it's hard to understand the realities of producers. So I think through advocacy, which is a very strong pillar that we have also at AmFree, I'm talking from our side, I think there can be a good two-way relationship sometimes. But yeah, again, it's a huge conversation that could take a long time. Maybe we can discuss later over coffee as well. We have a question from Ahmed Ansari, ZDHC.
Thank you. Well, I do not have question, but I would just like to add up some additional information, what basically it is being discussed here. I'm from ZDSC, which is Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals, is a brand-driven initiative with the whole supply chain and the chemical industry on sustainable chemical management and also the related impact area, which is greenhouse gas. So this is a little bit background. And appreciating that Amphori, when you do the survey, it's basically coming the similar kind of a resonance coming also with our members and also with our partner members, which is an SSE. And it is quite interesting that, well, within the entire scope 1, scope 2, 3, 80% of the emission is happening in the scope 3. But then there is a question comes in, is it scope 3 everywhere? And I think there is a real hotspot. This is not at the tier 1, which is basically having only 10% of the emission. 80 to 90% emission is happening in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. And I think this is where, when we are basically scoping the scope 3, where is this hotspot is, we need to really go really down on tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, because this is the area where you can really target to reduce and to come up with the kind of an engagement we are speaking about. I just wanted to add one important point. When it comes to an engagement with the supply chain, it is extremely important, and we are giving our own experience, is that the suppliers at all these different levels of the supply chain, they are really having a very positive resonance to engage with the brands and the retailer. But the important point is that they would really like to see what is the incentive when they are engaging with us. And this is exactly the point is, so we basically, I mean, there are a lot of different tools appreciating, Amphori, BP. They are mostly going on a calculation. But I think what is important is the supplier, they really would like to go for a kind of a plan which shows their return of investment. And there are really, I mean, we have come up with a certain kind of resource efficiency module. We develop that. We give these tools to the supplier where they really come up with a kind of a certain incentive, return of investment, how much they have to really do the actions, which is really bringing an economic value to them. This is extremely very important, because that's what they say, well, if I do it, what is the incentive? I mean, well, business is one incentive, but having their own reduction, return of investment is extremely important. And I think the second factor where we have really come up with the engagement with the financial sectors. There are so many different banks and the financial institutions. They are really giving a certain additional incentive that if you as a supplier, let's say the supply chain of your retailers and your members, you really come up with this kind of initiative, there is a kind of a financial low interest credit line given by the financial institutions to the supply chain, where initially they need some sort of a financial aid, which they come up with an engagement. So when it comes to a collaboration, I think it is extremely important. We can think about this financial institution as a collaborator to really come up with the kind of an push-up factor which help the supply chain to come up with the kind of as an incentive. I just wanted to give a little bit like our experience so that we have an additional component to make it more successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are already on time, I believe. So I'm really sorry, I wish we could have taken more questions, but if there are some questions, we can have them over coffee, which is always more fun. So I would like to thank you all. I think we have something for you. Simon, sorry, we'll just send you virtual hugs, unfortunately. Thank you very much. It's always great to talk about these things. I really believe in collaboration at Amphori. We believe in partnerships and collaboration. So it's really great to have you all here. Really hope that we'll continue to work together in the future. And please, a very big round of applause for our speakers.